morning. Good morning, everyone. I enjoyed the first session, and I certainly hope that this one is as useful as what I witnessed earlier. But I'm here to talk to you all about some ancillary issues surrounding the abolishment of Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system. My presentation will proceed in three parts. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about the pre-2018 practices when it comes to race in jury in the state of Louisiana. So this is what we did before we ended non-unanimous juries first. The second part of the presentation will sort of explain how we did the work of ending these non-unanimous juries. And then finally, you will be surprised to hear that this issue remains with us. So there are lots of ancillary issues that never got resolved when these juries ended. And so that will be the final part of the presentation. And I'm happy to be able to share a lot of traction that is either in the form of legislation or court rules that are unfolding around the country. So there seems to be some precedent for change that we could follow here in the state, and I'm going to be offering that. Very informal presenter, so feel free to interrupt as you would like. And if you need a break, let me know that as well. We can pause when you're ready to pause. But I'm starting now, so you should be at the next slide, and I'm getting ready to do the intro part, which is sort of putting the context together about race and juries in Louisiana. There's just no way to really do a meaningful evaluation of these ancillary issues without looking at non-unanimous juries in their proper historical context. Doing that, unfortunately, is going to require us all to hit the rewind button and take this very painful journey all the way back to slavery, because this is really the genesis of this conversation. During that slavery era, people of color had no right to serve on a jury. They also had no right to have a jury. They didn't have the right to be tried in courts of law. What happened back then was they used these slave tribunals, and the jury were slave owners. And of course, we know the outcome, of course, of all of those cases. There was just no protection from the legal, marginalized by operation of law until the year 1865. And then 1865, something magical happens, which is they're emancipated. And so we're getting ready to take a glimpse into that emancipation process. So if you can start the video, I'm going to ask you as you watch this video to not consider jury service from the present state with your present knowledge, but to consider jury service and the right to a jury trial from the standpoint of these people that you're going to see in these uniforms, in these military uniforms. So you can start it.
On that island sits Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell shattered the pre-dawn sky, and the United States, just 85 years old, erupted into all-out civil war. Initially, for President Abraham Lincoln, the war was about a single overriding goal: saving the Union from the forces of secession in the American South, forces that were threatening to tear the Republic apart.
There was a ditty that people used to sing around Union recruiting that I think sums up what Lincoln's original orientation was. It went something like, I stand for the Union, all its foes I abhor. I ain't for the N-word, but I am for the war.
Soon after the war began, its focus began to change when enslaved African Americans, forced to work in the Confederacy's defense, escaped behind Union lines.
Escaped slaves who run away to Union lines are called contraband. And what Union policymakers, including Lincoln, begin to recognize is this creates a welcome disruption among the Southern slaveholders. This deprives them of their property, it shuts down their plantations, and it makes their war effort more difficult.
The swelling numbers of contraband pushed President Lincoln to see that the Civil War was actually about abolishing the institution of slavery, ultimately leading him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
In many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation is, first and foremost, a military policy. it's not clear the Union is winning the war before the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation also gives these escaped slaves the opportunity to serve in the Union Army. This is crucial to the Union's success in the war effort.
With the freedom of their people at stake, almost 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, playing a pivotal role in bringing victory to the North.
The key element that changed the outcome of this war in terms of who won it and in terms of what it was about were the slaves themselves. Their determination that this war was going to be about the end of slavery. Masses of self-liberated slaves became the wave that the Union would ultimately ride to victory.
So what the video didn't depict is people who were freed. The video actually showed people who took freedom. And that's a very different narrative. The video shows us people who were extremely patriotic, people who had great optimism in this American dream, people who were a marginalized population, finally enthusiastic about the idea of inclusion. And then Abraham Lincoln is killed, and we enter Reconstruction with no presidential support for the transition of these emancipated people. But we do have Congress willing to help. Congress wants badly to ensure their inclusion into American society, and so we get these Reconstruction amendments. In 1868, Congress gives us the 14th Amendment, which is to convert these pieces of property, this contraband, over into citizens. And it tells them that they are equal, which means they will not be marginalized in this country anymore. It tells them that they're going to enjoy now life as an American citizen. And Congress goes on in 1870 to give them the 15th Amendment, which guarantees that they have a right to vote that will not be taken. Now, what's important is at this hour, people of color are embracing citizenship. So they're actively voting, they're seeking employment, they're gainfully interested in serving on juries, they want to be educated. And so it is incorrect when we say that Reconstruction ended. What is correct is that it was actually abandoned. And once it was abandoned, these very people that received all of these grand promises from Congress now revert back to this life of marginalization. And so on a very typical day at this point in Reconstruction, we see these people now over-policed. We see them frequently being arrested, not because they are breaking the law, but because we have an active convict leasing system that needs their bodies. So once again, they begin to be commodities in this country. They are victims of labor exploitation. They're experiencing voter suppression, domestic terrorism, violence, lynching daily. But most importantly for our purposes, exclusion now from the very jury service that Congress just enacted through federal legislation as a guarantee to them that they would get. So they feel now, just a matter of years from being emancipated, that they're back in a system of chattel slavery. So when we think of jury service in Louisiana, most legal professionals, most court officials think that people of color are simply unwilling, uninterested in the process of participating in juries. So I want us to think about, has that always been the case? There's so much evidence to the contrary. So if you look at this screen, which the one that you just had, if you don't mind, go back. What you're going to see, this is only a glimpse, and it's overwhelming. This is not an accurate picture of how many attempts people of color have made either to have the right to a jury trial that is constitutional or to be a participant in the jury process. This is troubling because if you look at the dates, it is prolonged and it is consistent. And these are the cries of people of color to be a part of the jury box. So now I want to talk to you about this 1870 reference here. Keep in mind, this is only 5 years after freedom. 5 years after we've emancipated. What are people doing in 1870? These newly emancipated people are on a campaign writing letters to Congress in 1870 saying, Congress, you gave us these rights to be on juries, but they won't allow it. This is black folks who are asking to be on juries, the very people that we believe have no interest in being a part of that service. So Congress is trying to help, and what do? They give us the Civil Rights Act of 1875. That sounds like an old law, but that should alarm everyone, because guess what that law says? It is illegal in this country to use race as a factor to stop someone from sitting on a jury. It's a crime, by the way, so that means somebody should be punished for taking that right from a citizen of color, and this is 10 years after freedom. So you can see that it wasn't apathy or lack of interest. It was systemically that they were not being allowed to serve. But these people still want citizenship, so what do? They resort to getting into the newspaper. So if you look at 1876, you see editorials where black citizens are writing op-eds saying, hey, I want to sit on a jury. 1880, we get this landmark Strata versus West Virginia case where it is not black folks that are not showing up for the jury in 1880. If you look, it is state law that says you can't come, right? So they sue. Why? Because they want to participate. In 1886, guess what Homer Plessy's doing? He's not sitting in the back of the rail car like you may think, but in 1886, he's sitting in the room with the Justice Protective Educational and Social Club. And what are they doing in New Orleans in 1886? They are arguing that there's no equal protection in segregation, and they're fashioning strategies to do what? Not the rail car at this point. They're fighting Jim Crow juries. Imagine that. Louis A. Martinet, I think when I saw you last, I was an invitation from Louis A. Martinet. He's in the room with Homer Plessy in 1895 with the Citizens Committee. And if you read those minutes, it will just give you chills. The energy in the room of these black activists in the 80s trying to organize strategies to combat what they termed the Jim Crow jury. 1947, look at the slide. Guess what the NAACP is doing? They're tired of going to courts of law in the United States, so they go to the whole United Nations. And guess what the grievance is over? Black folks being denied the right to sit in the jury box. 1948, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois is expressing these same grievances that black people want to serve on juries and they can't. By 1954, we have now people of Mexican descent joining the chorus, arguing that they too are being oppressed. By 1961, the United States Civil Rights Commission is acknowledging a pattern from the genesis of freedom in this country of excluding blacks from the jury. 1968, Louisiana wants to take a man's liberty and don't even give him the right to a jury trial, so that has to be brought before the Supreme Court. And by the way, Gary Duncan lives anonymously still in the state, unknown for the piece of history he has made in Duncan versus Louisiana. This is a black man whose life was on the line and he fought to change law. 1972, Oregon, and 1972, Louisiana both get decisions out of the Supreme Court on the same day. This Johnson versus Louisiana decision becomes important for our later discussion of the 1974 Constitutional Convention, so make note of it. But what I want you to recognize from this slide is that there has been litigation and agitation from emancipation to the present moment for black people to have the right to sit on juries and for black people to have their freedom decided by a jury of their peers. So this idea that we're not interested is a false narrative, and I want to be sure that we deconstruct that. Now, I want us to think about those men in the uniforms in the video. Having heard this, Imagine having put up that fight to be a part of a country, and this is what awaited them after that civil rights battle. And I'm trying to be sure that we have this historical understand that law has made promises to people of color that it has refused to keep. And this is a documented fact. So what has happened to people of color with this jury justice issue is a lack of access before emancipation, a lack of access after emancipation, and alarmingly, a lack of access after Louisiana has changed this non-unanimous jury law. So this ultimately has reduced all of these cases and agitation to 4 scenarios that we're gonna be talking about. One is just the idea you don't get a jury. That's been an obstacle that we've had to overcome. 2 is that you're gonna not be called into the jury pool in your proper proportion in the community. That's an obstacle we're gonna talk about. 3, you get to get into the jury box, but we just marginalize you by way of ignoring your reasonable doubt. That was the non-unanimous jury system. And then the last issue, which we'll talk about extensively, is you get past all those obstacles. You get called in and you get to the jury box only at that point to be struck later because of race. So all the time what we've had on record, if you go to the next slide, and please don't ever forget this, the length of time we've had the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The length of time that we've had state law regulating jury discrimination, the length of time we've had federal law regulating jury discrimination, all of that predated non-unanimous juries. And tragically, all of it has outlived the end of non-unanimous juries. So why, in my research, I have often tried to understand, was there this unwillingness to allow Black people to have this access? And what I realized is in the South, there was this idea that the jury box is a site of power. It's a site of prestige. It's almost like for this one moment that I'm in that jury box, I'm holding a public office. I get to decide things that are really significant, like what happens to you for the rest of your life. And so we do not want that power sharing in the South. And so researchers have termed this idea the notion that Blacks are just simply inept to be an arbiter of the life or the liberty or property of a white man. So Southern juries became the site of a continuation of white domination over Blacks. Now, is there a point to this? Do I just want to throw all this race stuff out? Absolutely not. There is a point. And if you go to the next slide, the point is for us to come to terms with this idea of institutional racism. To help us understand that in the South, juries have been living manifestations of institutional racism. And what do I mean by institutional racism? I've provided my best definition on the slide, but it's the idea that there's a cumulative and compounding effects of a bunch of social factors that systemically privileges one dominant group and disadvantages individuals of a marginalized group. And when it comes to juries, whether it be for either the accused person or the juror themselves, Blacks have an unparalleled experience, and it would be irresponsible and dishonest of me to talk to you about non-unanimous juries as if they are not attached to this history. Now, there are ancillary issues, and they must be evaluated in these contours. That is important. And so I'll now move on to screen 2 and talk to you a little bit, now that you understand that context, how did this system come to an end? Well, the media started covering this around 2018, but the effort started about 3 years prior to that. And it started with the core group of about 6 folks who simply just wanted to see an end to this for various reasons. So you're gonna see a film that details all of this in a second, but there was one point that you should understand going into this. The group of us didn't have a unanimous agreement about how to end the system. So I was a strong believer that this had to be corrected in the legislature, simply because we are civilian jurisdiction. And in my mind, that is why we have a civilian jurisdiction, because you should be at the legislature. There were a number of us who said that is not correct, it won't happen there, and they were strong advocates of litigation. So we all agreed to disagree, and everybody did what their talent allowed. And in the end, we all feel like we won because it happened both at the legislature and through litigation. So I'm going to give you this video. It's a 15-minute, very good overview of what happened, but also in your materials, the 64 Parishes Encyclopedia of Louisiana just chronicled this history, so you also have a written version, but I'm going to let her show the video so you can sort of see the process of getting this done.
Our Paris headlines at the beginning of Lafayette, where lawmakers and members of law enforcement, past and present, are rallying in support of the unanimous jury amendment on the November ballot. Right now, Louisiana is one of only 2 states in the U.S. where unanimous juries are not needed to convict a suspect. Supporters of the amendment say the current law is un-American.
This is about liberty, justice, and fairness. And if you love the Constitution and you love the Bill of Rights and you love the liberty that we are guaranteed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, then you will want to vote for amendment number 2.
When it comes to Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system, we have a narrative. And the narrative goes something like this. Because the United States Supreme Court has not rendered the system unconstitutional, it is somehow legal, and because it is legal, it is not harmful. I'm here today to deconstruct the narrative and to talk to you about the counter-narrative, which is so very important as we search for justice in the state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John DeRosier, District Attorney, Calhoun Parish. I've heard a lot about this system being adopted as a result of a vestige of slavery. I have no reason to doubt that. I'm not proud of that. That's the way it started. But it is what it is. However, ladies and gentlemen, that was 138 years ago. We have 2 constitutional conventions since then, one in 1974, that have not changed the concept of unanimous versus non-unanimous. When I was 13, I said, Daddy, what's a conservative? He said, well, son, the best way I can define that is, a conservative is a person who, when he gets ready to change something, he looks at what he's getting ready to change to make sure it is better than what he's got already. So I would suggest to you, that is the issue that we're here about today.
If you like the 1957 film classic 12 Angry Men, then you'll love Louisiana's version, 10 Angry Men. Simpler and faster. This Bayou blockbuster has been packing them into the big house for over 119 years. 10 Angry Men was a vestige of the notorious Louisiana Constitutional Convention of 1898. This black and white classic features a conviction conveyor belt so efficient it's still in existence today. Shocking, savage, explosive. We know they're guilty because 83% of jurors reached a unanimous decision. Hell, you ain't got to pass the bar to throw folks behind them. 10 Angry Men, a Jim Crow production.
This campaign was all the right people. It was all the right people. It did, though. It really did. And I have no doubt, like, I cannot conceive of anything happening except victory tonight. Like, I feel that convicted about it.
I ain't saying nothing until we get
Okay, good. Let's do it. Okay, and I'm gonna give you mine. Now, would you snap a picture of us right quick, and I'm gonna give you mine? Come on, he's gonna take our picture, and then I'll send it.
When you have non-unanimous jury verdicts, those deliberation processes are actually verdict-driven. When you require unanimity, those deliberation processes are actually evidence-driven. When it's just non-unanimous, they're gonna take a quick count and see how close they are to 10. And if they have their 10, then boom, they can go give their verdict and then be done. So y'all are here in Louisiana. A lot of people don't know that it's one of the prison capitals of the world, but it is something that should offend everybody in this room. One of the most dangerous phrases we have is we've always done it this way. So why are you trying to change this system? A system that they think works. And so when somebody tries to tell you that we've always done this way as their justification to continue to do it, don't accept that.
I am so utterly offended for you to start your comments and say, I know that this rooted in slavery, but it is what it is. And I needed you to hear that from me. And I wish you would look at me while I'm speaking with you, because I think I deserve that kind of respect after you just disrespected me on this committee. You are elected to represent everybody, and to admit that it started in slavery and say it is what it is. I hope the people of your parish are listening. And if they aren't, I'm going to make sure that they know what you said today. I am utterly offended.
They listen.
And for you not to even look at me in my face. This is a problem. I don't need your apology.
So when you walk into that 1898 Constitutional Convention, you would have noticed that the participants were all white males.
There were around 138 white delegates trying to decide what they were going to do with this newly freed slave population.
These quotes are not just from anybody, and you should know the first one is from Mr. Thomas Sims, who was the chair of the Judiciary Committee.
We looked at the transcript, and they were very clear about their intentions of the Constitutional Convention.
And I quote to you, "The work we have done should be crowned as worthy. In all states, those in power seek to maintain it. Our mission was to establish the supremacy of the white race in this state to the extent which it could be done legally and constitutionally." Those are the words of the chairman of the Judiciary Committee.
How can you say that you've been convicted beyond a reasonable doubt when two people on the jury don't think you're guilty? This is a liberty issue. Why have we been deprived of the full protection of the Sixth Amendment? Why? Why is Mississippi ahead of us on this? Hello, I'm Ed Tarpley. Yes, and what is your name? Well, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. And who's over here? Hey, Karen. Ed Tarpley. Good to see you. Lanny's my old buddy from college. We go a few years back. That's right.
If I remember over at the donut shop, he was against the new deal.
That's right. I've softened up a little since then. Unanimity is the critical and crucial part of the jury trial protection. Without unanimity, you don't have the full protection of the right to trial by jury.
When we did the very first non-unanimous jury talk in the year 2015, the advocate was in our audience. And after that talk, I met with those reporters at the advocate to talk to them about how they might be able to help gather data. And it took them 8 months of collecting the data. We should all know now that they've released their findings in the series called Tilting the Scale. It is quite compelling, and it is one of the things that I think got this successfully through the legislation. series, there were people like myself who was given anecdotal thoughts. Once that series came out, it was documented with data, and you just can't refute those numbers. Oh, I'm so glad. Very glad it helped. Very glad. Every time I speak, I get thrown off the stage. I'm so used to it right now. I can go on and on and on with this. So thank you all so much for entertaining this. And if you have questions, you have my email address.
I tell folks all the time, it wasn't happening.
Well, it was not just me. It was so many people, and I cannot tell you that. But I was like the bulldog sending emails and wouldn't stop until we got.
I mean, nobody knew about it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've been preaching the good word to your class.
Well, listen, I am just a messenger, and without all the army that got this word out, it wouldn't have happened. So listen, we're gonna all go down in history for doing this work. And when this smoke come in, I'm gonna get on the dance floor and I'm gonna turn off.
It really brought together people from all points of the political spectrum. I mean, here's a conservative Republican former prosecutor like myself, and Angela, she's a professor at Southern Law School, and Marjorie was executive director at ACLU at the time. Well, that's a pretty unusual mix of people right there. I think the real untold story was the leadership of the Louisiana Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. They had decided early in the year to make this a priority item for their legislative package. And they had actually approached me and asked me if I would testify in the committees. And I agreed to do so.
I'm going to yield my opening to the gentleman on my left, and I will reserve my comments for closing.
Thank you, Senator Morrell. Good morning, committee. It's an honor to be here. This is a very important and historic piece of legislation because I would venture to say that in our lifetime, we will never face another opportunity like this. The opportunity to repeal a 138-year-old law that goes back to the Jim Crow era of Louisiana.
First of all, I'm going to address the white elephant in the room straight up. I know that this bill, there's a lot of talk about the racist element of it. Up front, I'm not a racist. I deplore racism. I've been against racism my entire life. I may be the only district attorney in Louisiana that put a white man on death row for killing an African American, and he's still there. Juries don't represent groups of people. That's what you as legislators do. Jurors are picked, hopefully they will apply the law to the facts. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. People get on juries with agendas, and it cuts both ways.
I wanted to know why the DA's Association hasn't taken a position. Are you aware of why they haven't done so?
Yes, sir. We as an organization never take positions when we have one or two members, three, that are opposed. We have people for reasons, and I'm not here to speak for them about their reasons. But when we don't have virtually 100%, we don't take a position, and that's what happened in this particular situation.
The DA's Association did not take a position because you all couldn't get a unanimous decision. All right, Denise. Let me see if I got, because I heard you say 2 or 3.
In closing, let me just say this. We should not be defined by this. We have come so far. This type of thing holds our state back. I appreciate your time listening to all this, and I would sincerely hope that y'all will vote to move this bill favorably as amended. Thank you.
Representative James has moved to report SB 243 as amended favorable. Is there any objection? Committee, I want to commend you. There's no objection. Congratulations, sir.
You can stop it. So the point was for you to see that it was a lot of years of getting out to the community and helping the community understand what was going on with these juries. And what surprised me was when I started the research, I really thought the problem was the racist history of the law. Then I got an invitation to go out to Angola to speak to the guys about what we were trying to do at the legislature, and Angola would only allow into the session those folks who were convicted by these non-unanimous juries. So when I got there and realized that about half of these folks are not black, then I realized this is not really just a race issue. This is something deeper than that. In that room I witnessed that day, and that led me to go back and rethink the power of the research. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But what was important to me is to begin to help people understand that this did have a racist history, but because of the way we fund our justice system and because of the speed that it moves, it started to engulf people of all races. It's a poor person's issue, is actually what it became. So you saw how the legislative piece happened. Now I quickly want to tell you a little bit about that advocate data. There was a case out of New Orleans right before the vote, so around 2017, and it was the Christopher Lee ruling. Advocate approached me and said, how can we help? And so one of the things that I was able to share with them was that, we're doing this community work, and when we were talking to people, there were a lot of people who just believed me because I'm Professor Bell, but there were many more people who said, where's your proof? And we don't have any. And then, of course, so we're running into this challenge in the community needing data, and then the lawyers in the court needed the data. So once that study was completed by the advocate, and it took almost a year to get that done, that study was the weapon that was used in the Melvin Maxey litigation. And so Maxey didn't get a lot of coverage, and it was deliberate, and I'll tell you why, but it was filed in 2016, and it challenged in Natchitoches this system as being unconstitutional. Maxey is the first ruling we get out of Louisiana that actually declared this system unconstitutional, but it comes the week of the vote. And so we made a very tactical decision not to tell the public about Maxey because we were very fearful that if people heard the ruling, they would just not go vote. And then if it got overturned, we're back with this law. So it's a little unfair to those attorneys because they really did, historically, the first ruling that changed this, but their ruling only happened because of the Christopher Lee ruling that denied it and gave the roadmap, and then the advocate supplying the missing data. And so I just want to mention that this really was overturned in part because of the legislature and in part because of that Maxey litigation. So now I'm ready to move on to the final piece, which is the most valuable for you all, which is all of these ancillary issues and what can be done about them. So one of the things that I want you to look at, if you move to the slide with the jury, I'm just wondering, as you look at this slide, given the conversation we're having today, if anything about this slide just strikes you as a little bit concerning. Given the conversation we've had today, does anything about the slide seem a little concerning? So we see an all-white jury. So that is our first ancillary issue, which is that we were fighting for 12, and we got 12, as you see, but the communications that I've been getting consistently since 2018 from lawyers in federal and state court is that, Professor Bell, the 12 we're getting are all white people. And so now we have a new problem because we're getting 12 and they're not diverse. Now, why is that important? What is important about all of this, I don't think ever really got told to the public during the campaign, which is the power of that deliberative research. So let's talk about that. In 1972, when the Supreme Court of the United States issued that Apodaca ruling, that was a question of whether it's okay to have 11 or 10, or do you really need 12? And in the court's analysis, the court said, look, all you need is to get folks in the jury box, and all you need is for those folks to listen, and that's good enough to be a deliberation. We didn't know any better in 1972 because there was no research. But that Apodaca ruling inspired amazing research on the deliberative process, and it tells us some things now that tells us Apodaca was wrong. one of the first things we learn is that when a group needs to make a decision, if the group is all the same, not all the same race, not all the same gender, that's not what I mean. I mean all the same perspectives, all the same experience, you're going to get a rush decision and it's going to be flawed. So we know that when you can diversify by experience, when you can diversify by age, by gender, by geography, all of those things end up slowing the process down. Why? Because people's experiences and perspectives cause them to evaluate information differently. And so people are going to ask questions based on their experiences. And during that questioning process, people can sometimes then correct misunderstandings. They can also go back and measure inaccurate statements. And so what we're finding is that if the juries are all the same people, then we're not getting a process that is any more credible than we got when we had this non-unanimous jury system. So this research is compelling. And now the question is, why is this jury all white? And so I have, for the last 2 years, I've been doing talks in the community about this. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we did them by Zoom. So they're all on YouTube, and we titled them, is Black Folks Missing in Action, or are they missing by practice? And what we've been doing is trying to use it as a tool to teach the community about this science and how their presence can shape these decisions and make these decisions more meaningful. But one of the first issues that I am finding that is causing this lack of representation is the use of these strikes. And it is not just the peremptory strikes, it is the cause strikes as well. But when we talked a minute ago about Maxie is the greatest example of how this happens. So I want to talk to you about the strikes that were used in Maxie. There was a black male juror in this Maxie case who the white male prosecutor struck. And he said, the reason I'm striking him, he didn't state the reason on the record, but the defense attorney overheard him say, it's because he's stupid. He's too stupid. That's what he said. And then when it's time for him to present the race-neutral reason to the court, he tells the court it's something about his demeanor. It's just something about the way he's answering the questions. I just didn't like the way he's handling himself in the jury box. That's his race-neutral reasons. The trial judge says, well, that certainly sounds race-neutral to me. And the trial judge decides that that was not a race reason. And as a result, that juror was struck. Now, what that trial judge did not know is that there's a particular history about race and intelligence in the South. During slavery, there were medical doctors who they became almost expert celebrities in the South, but they would advance these theories. The one that comes to mind is Dr. Cartwright, Samuel Cartwright, who would go around to all of the plantations between Louisiana and Mississippi, and he treated the enslaved folks for these severe injuries because they didn't get medical care unless they were severe. But Dr. Cartwright had so much respect amongst these slave owners that they started consulting with him, and he started researching and writing these theories. And one of his theories he wrote was that if somebody houses you and they feed you and they give you clothes and you still want to run away, you have to be mentally ill. And so he calls that drapetomania. And it is published, and he's gone all around the country teaching this theory of drapetomania, which is black people are mentally ill, right? Because they're not happy being taken good care of on these plantations. And then he also advances the notion that we're intellectually inferior, and that science left the plantation and it fueled the whole movement of segregation down south. That became a rationalization for distinguishing and othering people of color down south, but that all stems from that slavery science. But guess what happens? Sooner or later it gets into the jury box. So we have one recorded case of a judge in 1895 in Louisiana, in New Orleans, who goes on the record and says, yeah, I'm excluding blacks from the jury. You know why? Because they lack intelligence and they lack moral standing. By the way, the 1898 Constitutional Convention, which is where this law got changed, that language appears there again, where they say we're trying to remove all of the corrupt and illiterate black voters because it was a voter suppression constitution as well. What these attorneys did post-trial in Maxey is something all defendants don't get, because the Capital Assistance Center has resources and they had an investigator. So they were able to go out and investigate and build the case. And guess what they find out about the stupid juror? He's a high school graduate. Unlike many of the whites who were able to sit on the jury, they weren't high school graduates. He had studied welding. He had learned to play a musical instrument. He performed in a band. He was a deacon in church who regularly taught the Bible. He had served on another jury in that same parish. He had a 30-year career in a plant as a trim operator. And so post-trial, when they go back on with this information, the court reverses itself and says, you know what? That is discrimination. Now, I just wrote my first book about race and justice, and I've done some research about some of the race-neutral reasons that prosecutors in Louisiana are offering to courts. Listen to some of these. Being a single black male with no children, that is a race-neutral reason. Enjoying rap music. Being a smartass. Being Baptist. Being the only juror wearing shorts on the first day of voir dire. Being employed at a casino, looking like a drug dealer, wearing gold jewelry and a t-shirt. Now, if you take a look at the next slide, Justice Johnson has given us some insights here that I think are worth considering relative to these Batson challenges. But as long as these Batson challenges go unignored, what they are doing is preventing jurors of color from participating in the same way jurors of color were prevented by Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system. So that remains one of the lingering issues, but there are solutions. And I'm giving two, and it's not one or two, it is one and two. So one is there needs to immediately be some credible cultural competency training for all judges. Not just trial judges, because some of this has to be reviewed on appeal. Yes?
I need a point of clarification. The examples that you gave, were those race-neutral reasons given subsequent to a Batson challenge?
Correct. That's what was stated on the record when asked, what is your race-neutral reason? Correct. And so when I looked at all of these cases, it is clear that there are judges who don't have the cultural competency training to recognize some of these subtleties. So that would be my first suggestion, that there needs to be credible, not just trial judges who have to make these determinations, but appellate judges who have to review them as well. And also, I am so inspired by Rule 37. So if you look in your material, this, I am just blown away by this. This, I think, is a solution that could be considered by Louisiana. And this is a rule that does not come from the legislature. I have it labeled as page 5 in my materials. It doesn't come from the legislature. That's what I love about this. This is a Supreme Court rule. But guess what this rule does? Listen to this. It outlaws peremptory challenges based on implicit, institutional, and unconscious race and ethnic bias. So this is an attempt to get around any of these race-neutral reasons. They also go so further. Look at Section C. Section C allows the judge to actually raise the objection if the judge is witnessing what appears to be bias or racism in the court. Also, Section E is a very important section. It requires courts to evaluate the reasons that prosecutors give, and it requires the judge, listen to this language, to determine if an objective observer could view race or ethnicity as a factor. And then I love Section G, because G actually gives the court some insights to consider if they don't have that cultural competency training. So G tells the court, hey, look at the questions being posed to that juror. Look at whether all the jurors are getting that same question or just that jurors of that color. All of G is the kinds of things that would trigger an alert to the court. But then it goes on to give presumptively invalid reasons here. Some of those are if the person says, I had prior contact with law enforcement, I don't trust law enforcement, I live in a high crime neighborhood. All of those reasons are listed. I'm on pages 5 and 6 of your materials to give the judge an alert that you might be dealing with something that is pretextual here. And also, there's some traction around the country on this.
I apologize. Where is this from?
This is from Washington State. And this is the Supreme Court, so this is not the legislature. Oh, yeah, oh boy, this would be a dream to see this happen in Louisiana. Yeah, it's Washington Supreme Court, but I mean, imagine how easy that would be to do if the Supreme Court would adopt this. But California was inspired by this. So in 2020, California adopted the same legislation, but they even expanded it further. So California presumes all strikes to be invalid if the reason for the strike is based on appearance or demeanor. Now think about Maxie, right? This would have handled that problem. Or if somehow it is dealing with work-related issues like that, I work in a casino thing, California presumes that to be invalid. 2021, Arizona saw this and adopted it, but they went even further. Guess what Arizona did? They've abolished all peremptory strikes in civil and criminal cases. So you can sort of see that there is a movement around the country to to honor the Sixth Amendment, and we are still not doing anything about the abuses of these strikes, and that is a big obstacle that undermines all of that work and all of that energy you all saw in that room that night. You know, we were all so excited thinking we had just accomplished something, and it's being undermined as long as this is allowed to happen. Yes, ma'am.
When I was on the appeals court, I had a case. I was trying to do research to reverse a jury verdict, and I needed to look at different. I couldn't find anything in the Fourth Circuit, so I looked around the state, and I don't remember what parish it was. It was awful. It was a late 1970s case. And it's the opposite of this. It's like the guy was sentenced to life, and I don't remember what his crime was, but he was appealing a decision of allowing a admitted KKK member, the guy said, oh no, I'm a former KKK member. His attorney, he said, well, how long ago, sir? I said, oh no, I'm reformed. I'm no longer part of the KKK anymore. And the judge, so he said, I challenged him for cause. He said, no, he was out of peremptory, so he couldn't get rid of him. He challenged him for cause, and then the judge said, look, he said he was former, that's fine. Got all the way up to our Supreme Court in the late 70s, and they said, that's harmless error, if any. But he admitted that he was and said that he was reformed, and that's good enough. What? I almost choked when I said I said it to every judge on my bench. I said, if you all ever uphold something like this, I said, I swear y'all gonna get a meeting with me. I said, yes. Come get y'all. It's ridiculous.
And
yes. We had the DA would get the jury roll, run their rap sheet, and they would use arrest as a reason. And we know how
disproportionately.
And when we took it up, the court is like it's a race neutral reason, which can't be so, because we know arrest itself is skewed. The numbers are.
That's from what I've seen in the research. A lot of this could be corrected at the point of the race neutral reasons being given, and it's not. It's just not. Judges are deferring to the prosecutors, and a lot of times it's obvious to me, it may not be to them. So that's why I'm thinking the cultural competency training or even guidance through legislation like this, because this gives great guidance. This sort of tells you if you're not culturally competent, we're going to tell you some stuff to watch for. So that's a really good model to consider. The other thing is when we talk about why are these juries lacking diversity, the Advocate in its series found, and I'm quoting, the proportion of black people in Louisiana's juries are often diluted. Almost every parish in the state pulls prospective voters at random from voter rolls. Only a few use the licensed drivers, and the Advocate built this database looking at a 6-year window, and they found in 9 of the 10 busiest courthouses there is an underrepresentation simply because of who's being called in the pool. East Baton Rouge Parish, they specifically quoted, has a 10% difference, a disparity, and that gap, according to the Supreme Court, is unconstitutional. So the better practice is to use multiple source lists. We know from the Supreme Court it's illegal to systemically exclude groups, and that's ultimately what is happening. And this is all around the state and in the federal courts. Interestingly, 1997, Louisiana amends its Code of Criminal Procedure Article 408.1 and literally says, we are expanding the sources that you can use here for your source list to make sure we avoid this issue. And it goes on record to say that you can use voter registration lists, but you can also go to the actual voters. You can go to voter licenses, registration records through the DMV, utility bills, that's all in the code. But most of the courts around the state refuse to abandon that practice of using just voter registration records. Now, the census tells us the average voter in this country is older, white, and more affluent. So if you're pulling from the voter registration records exclusively, you are always going to have an underrepresentation of people of color. So the solution is easy. It is to draw from other source lists. And we have evidence that that works. There's a judge called Juan Sanchez in Pennsylvania who saw this happening in his court, and he initiated some community meetings to address this. And one of the first things he did after talking to the community is to also enlarge the size of the court's master list. So they stopped using just the voter rolls, and they went to using driver's license. They also went to using public benefits records so that they could get a more expansive list of people. This is done in Michigan, has done the same thing, also led by two judges who simply felt concerned about the underrepresentation, and they report also just that simple modification addressed the underrepresentation in their districts. We also have Washington State's Jury Commission that made a concerted effort to do community outreach. They did buses, putting signs on buses explaining to people the importance of jury service. They did radio, they did media, they did talks in schools, colleges, elementary schools. So what we see, another judge in New York saw the problem, enlisted the bar. All of these jurisdictions are seeing the problem and going to outreach. This is easy for a place like New Orleans because you have Will Snowden here, who you saw in the video, whose entire life is doing this work. I've been doing this with my students literally in Baton Rouge by Zoom, just getting conferences together, and we do it as CLEs. So lawyers can sign up for CLEs, but it's also open to the community. But this is about educating the community, just like you saw in that video, and helping them understand what this science says, that they in fact are needed on these juries. Another problem with this all-white jury situation is the failure of courts to sanction. In the advocates' research, they found, and I'm quoting, most of the parishes are doing little to punish those folks who ignore summonses. The research tells us that if you sanction or even threaten to sanction, it increases juror turnout. There's one case out of the federal court in Baton Rouge where the attorney sent me the record where they asked the court to at least sanction, and the court said, do you understand the administrative nightmare that would be for us? If your people were interested in civic participation, they would just show up. So that has been a consensus around the state, the lack of will on the part of the courts to do anything when people don't show up. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, what about black folks? Are they just opting out, right? That is something we really need to talk about. So I want you to look on the screen, and in your material, you're going to see it on page 7 through 10. But there's a white female public defender that I reached out to in preparation for this. Her name is Elizabeth Hilton, and she's in the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. And she said that they were being confronted with this problem in San Francisco, and she got tired of seeing people convicted because the juries were all white. The problem was not, in her opinion, black people not wanting to serve. It was that service presented a hardship. And so what she fashioned was this idea that if they could get more than $25 a day, they might participate. So if you take a look at the second page of this, which is going to be page 8 in your materials, what it shows is that they increased the amount of the payout for coming to be on the jury from $25 to $100 a day. It doesn't go to everyone. You have to qualify by income to get that $100 a day, and they use philanthropic dollars to be able to fund this program. But the results are documented on page 8. 81% of the people said that if they had not had that $100 a day, they could not have come. She also reports that their increase was almost 63% in terms of color of who would serve on the jury. Interestingly, her numbers were not the presence of black people, but they were other minorities, which is desirable, right? And so this is a really great model, and this didn't cost the state any money, right? So now it just has to be sustained. And so I have all the research and the outcomes for you there on pages, all the way through page 12. But what I am seeing is that a lot of judges around the country are taking interest in this issue and are trying to fashion solutions either by connecting with community resources or with the local bar or with academics to try to fashion a response that could bridge this gap, because some of it is also getting the community to understand why they need to be there. There is great legislation on page 13 that you need to consider also coming out of Washington State concerning this very issue of jury diversity, and this just happened. Look at the date. January the 5th, 23. So it is a bill that was just put forth. But they are doing some significant things here. One, they want to collect data to know who are we getting out, who are we getting these summons out to, and who's coming in. Because if you don't have the data, you don't really know if you have an underrepresentation issue. The second thing that they're doing, I love, is that they're establishing a child care assistance program. Do you see that? That is another reason that a lot of people of color don't serve, because they don't have child care, and that becomes a hardship. They're also providing the increased benefits like we just saw with the Be the Jury program, so they're upping the amount of what you can get for coming to serve on the jury. And the last feature I absolutely love, look at that. It permits electronic service of the jury summons. So now we don't have to worry about it not getting delivered or somebody saying they didn't get received, because statistically we know that poor people are more mobile, right? They're not homeowners. They get evicted regularly. They have to move because another job comes up. So because of mobility, this feature could solve the problem, because now we're doing everything electronic, and now we don't have to worry about sending people out to serve people or not getting a notice delivered to the right address. So what I'm basically seeing when I study this issue is that to really want to confront this, like I'm seeing other jurisdictions do, you have to understand, if you go to the next slide, the difference between equity and equality. I love this illustration, and I hope that it impacts you the way it does for me when I see it. But if you look at the pink and the blue on the slide, yeah, that's the right one. You see that everybody basically on the pink side needs to cross the street, and everybody on the blue side needs to cross the street. When we think about equality, which is the pink image, we're thinking about treating everybody the same, right? We're equal. You treat me like I treat you. Equality used to be the word that we all wanted to aim for, but equality is flawed because it is based on the assumption that we all have the same needs, and we don't. And so the goal now is to consider being equitable in the things we do. And if you look at the blue illustration, guess what happens? We're not all equal because all of us can't walk. Some people have that wheelchair, right? So they're going to need some help getting across the street. And if you notice, in addition to the ramp on the blue side, you see the sound registry also, so that those people who can't hear, they have help hearing. So what we're trying to think about now with equity is understanding advantages and disadvantages, and understanding when we fashion a solution, it can't be the solution for one size that's going to fit everybody, that we need a solution like the ramp that considers what obstacles and advantages and disadvantages that you have to overcome. So being equitable means that I'm using all of my power and all of my resources to work collaboratively to draw systems that will include marginalized people. So what that means in short is, if you can't serve on the jury because you don't have child care, I've listened and I'll try to figure out a way to circumvent that. If you cannot afford to lose your wages for today because that's how you pay your car and your rent, I'll have to figure out a way to circumvent that. The equity piece is missing in this jurisdiction, and the equity piece is presenting itself in these other jurisdictions that are making these changes. And so I won't say that it is a lack of interest. I will say that it is it's a presentation of obstacles for a lot of people of color, like, of course, the child care, like, of course, the rate of not being able to afford to leave work for those wages that jury service is going to pay. And then a lack of understanding about the research and why you are absolutely needed in that jury box, and the history that we talked about of that struggle to get you there. Another ancillary issue was this 1974 convention, and everybody talks about when the law was presented again in 1974. Nobody said the word, we're here to advocate for the white supremacy, and therefore it sanitized the law. So a couple of things that I want to dispel is that what really caused this to come up at the 1974 convention was that litigation that I mentioned earlier, the Johnson case, because the Supreme Court had to visit the issue of whether 9 of 12 was legal. And there was some concerns in Louisiana that was going to come up again. And so that's what put this back on the conversation in 74. It was simply to challenge that potential constitutional issue coming up again. And that's what made us change it from 9 to 12 to 10 to 12. But you also have to remember, in 74, it was just not socially acceptable to go on a record anymore and say things like, this is about the supremacy of the white race. We were way more sophisticated about practicing racism there. So that's why you don't see that language. But Thomas Velasquez is the only black person surviving from that 74 convention. And he quoted to the Advocate that there was a racial dynamic in that room in 1974. You should also know Louisiana was nowhere near post-racial in 1974, because in 1972, you have the Angola 3 case that comes about because Angola was segregated, right? You have riots going on, race riots in Angola in 72. You have the big black Muslim Baton Rouge police shootout happening in 72. You have Gary Duncan's historic arrest in 1974. And what is that over? The refusal to let a black kid go to a white school in 74. So we know that this was not a post-racial era, and we know tensions were extremely high. So we need to be very clear that Louisiana was not post-racial, and that idea that there's nothing on the record somehow made this a sanitized version of the law is false. And then the next thing that I want to mention is the people who didn't get relief because of the law not being retroactive. And so we know the journey we've been on here. There's been litigation in Louisiana and Oregon since 2018. We know the Ramos litigation ultimately said that this court will allow retroactivity for all of those whose appeals are not final. But then that left all the folks who had final appeals to say, well, what about me? So that got us to Reddick, and that was in October of 2022. Louisiana Supreme Court said there's no relief for you. Louisiana Supreme Court said that your convictions are final. It would be an administrative burden for us to do anything for you. But there were 2 dissents in Reddick. One came from Judge Piper Griffin, and one came from Justice Genovese. Those 2 dissents must have been read by the officials in Oregon when they issued Watkins versus Ackley in December of 2022. So if you turn to page 16 of your material, you have a copy of that recent ruling from Oregon, but it literally adopts those 2 dissents. And what that ruling basically says is, look, every constitutional right will not be reversed on post-conviction if it is final. But in this instance, when you're talking about taking a man's liberty and violating the whole 6th Amendment to the Constitution, this warrants reversal. Although it is final, we are reversing. So Oregon just did something Louisiana would not do, and they did it for the reasons cited by these 2 justices in our Reddick Supreme Court opinion. Now, why is this alarming? Obviously, because we know now that this was a system with bad intentions who disproportionately affects people of color. But there's also a secondary issue. When I was in Angola and I said to the guys, make sure you all get your polling slips in case the law changes, I started getting letters back in the mail saying, Professor Bell, this clerk will not give me my polling slip. Can you call and help? So I started, it was only certain parishes that I would get the letters from. So I compiled the list, and it turns out Orleans Parish was one. So I called Orleans Parish and I said, you have no right to hold their polling slips. I need those polling slips because we thought if the law changed, guess what? Orleans says, Professor Bell, we're not holding them. We shred them. So we don't have them. Then we had the other problem with some of the jurisdictions where folks were convicted, where they were destroyed. They were never recorded. So there was no way to record those. But then there's this additional problem. The countless people that have written me letters saying that I was so afraid of those non-unanimous juries that I just took a plea. And so all of those folks that were incentivized into taking pleas now have no relief under the law. And I just want to make sure that that does not get overlooked.
I'm going to say something that I don't care where you fall on the spectrum on this. I mean, generally. But I remember when the decision came down from the Supreme Court, and I was still on the Fourth Circuit at the time, and I told my law clerks after I read the decision, I said, I am in favor of this. I said, but let me be clear with y'all. This is the only reason the conservative justices wrote this opinion. If you read, I think it was Gorsuch. I said, read, or whoever it was. I think it was Gorsuch that wrote it. He had one line in there. I said, I will bet y'all a bottle of their favorite vodka, not mine, that this is going to be the undoing of Roe v. Wade.
Yep.
I said, because I couldn't understand why one of our most liberal justices was so against this. I said, why is she so against this? And so that's when because I always read dissents first, and then I said, let me go read I said, oh my God. And they said, what? I said, in this opinion, I said, even though I am grateful for this, because it has always disturbed me, I said, he says, if the dissent takes issue with the fact that this is well-established precedent, and he says in that opinion, but if precedent was wrong to begin with,
yes,
then isn't it our duty to go? I said, damn it. I said, they're going to reverse Roe v. Wade. In that moment, and my law clerk said, they're not going to do it, Judge. I said, they're going to do it.
But that was the reasoning in the reversal, too.
They did it. I mean, I was happy that they did it, but then I understood why.
It was coming. But that was literally the reason they cited in the reversal of Roe. So, of course, the final two things I want to say to you is that I had this epiphany after years of doing this work, which is, the science really never got taught to the public. It never got taught because all of the PR folks kept saying the public is not that smart. Let's just stick to this liberty conversation. I'll talk about science. But the science now, I believe, can transfer to other spaces. And particularly as I wrote the book and saw how many judicial opinions came down from panels that were all unanimous and no dissents, and a lot of Batson challenges, prosecutorial misconduct, it is happening and witnessed in courts, but there's no dissent. And so I started thinking about this jury science and what it teaches us about the deliberation process. And so if you have a panel and the panel is all the same, you get flawed opinions. The same way a jury ends up making flawed decisions. But if you're in an administrative conference and everybody's the same, you're going to get flawed decisions the same way jury makes flawed decisions. So that jury diversity science, I think, lends itself well also to the deliberative process when it comes to judges who rule on panels or judges who make administrative decisions. And sometimes that different perspective might slow those decisions down and end up with more sound results. Final point is good news. All of this has been so morbid and bad, but I am now sitting on an advisory commission by invitation of the people of the United Kingdom. And that is simply because of the work we did in Louisiana to change the non-unanimous jury law. And so they are now working to end their non-unanimous jury law. And so the core group of us who did this work are working in conjunction with them. So our work in the state did inspire change globally. And then in addition to that, I'm consulting with some military lawyers who are also working to end military non-unanimous juries in military courts. So Louisiana did do good in terms of our global reach, but we still do have some shortcomings with these juries. So I just want to say, final slide, if you can go, or that's actually it. I reduced all of this down to an understanding of law essentially acting as a form of violence against certain communities. And I know that sounds real radical and really extreme, and so I want to make us understand this here. So if you look at this visual on the screen, there's a definition of violence that you should consider. Violence is the intentional use of force or power. So it doesn't have to be force, it can just be power, threatened or actual, against oneself or another, that results in a high likelihood of injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So now on the screen, you see this visual with these 6 types of violence. 4 of them should be obvious, but there are 2 that are very subtle. It happened and we don't even know that they're taking place. The first of which is structural violence. So I want you to understand that structural violence means when an institution can harm somebody or cause harm by preventing them from meeting their own basic needs. So an institution can actually engage in violence against people. And then there is this thing called cultural violence that is based in the notion that one culture is superior to another somehow. Now, what's the relationship here between all 6 of these forms of violence? Well, interestingly, those 2 that I just talked about, they basically reinforce the other 4. And so the first 2 cause the other 4, which leads to this never-ending cycle of violence. And so I want us to understand, particularly in this place at this moment where we're all consumed of talks of violence, law can actually become violent.
I think it's Edwards, but no, I'm not. I think it's Edwards that denied post-conviction collateral relief.
Mm-hmm.
Any aware of any legislative efforts to correct that, where someone, 20 years ago, 10-2, can seek remedy in the courts?
Louisiana did attempt that, and it was to basically create a forum for them to seek parole, so they wouldn't automatically get out, but that would advance them onto the parole process, and it failed. Guess why? They couldn't get an agreement on the vote, whether the vote should be unanimous. So it failed. But after Reddick came out, there is now talks that this next session there's going to be a new attempt, and I definitely think everybody's believing, because of what just happened in Oregon, that that's going to inspire action, if not shame people into action. But it's coming again. Yes.
So, what are your thoughts about around the question of diversity of the juries? Some parishes don't have that problem in terms of racial diversity.
Mhm.
I'm in a parish where there is a cross section racially, but not necessarily in terms of age or education. And so I find that the jury pool, although racially diverse, can be extremely common
Yes.
in their experience.
Mm-hmm.
Is the goal in terms of having a jury of peers, like, what does that open up to?
Yes.
And how does it intersect with diversity of experiences that are measurable in ways that are not black and white?
Yeah, that is an incredible question, because so many people wonder, is the goal just to get black and white? Because you can get black and white who all feel the same because they've all had the same experiences, right? So the goal is to get a different perspective. So to get people who don't have the same experiences, so that they don't have to all be white, all be black. They can be women, they can be young, old. But we want the ideal jury is that jury where you have a mix of experiences and perceptions and understanding levels. So one of the ways across the country that I've seen people achieve that is by allowing volunteers. That has been one way that has worked. So in other words, some jurisdictions don't allow for that, but others do, where a person could simply say, I'm going to volunteer for jury service. And there was one judge in New York that set up shop in the mall. And they were stopping people as they shop and say, hey, we're signing up for jury volunteers. And people signed up. And that's how they would call people. So if they ended up with a jury that didn't look as if it was diverse enough, they had a pool of volunteers to call in for service.
No, I'm laughing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm only, 2 years on the bench, and so much of what we said in some other sessions, so much that goes on internally, is the same old same.
Yes.
And then when you get, that's just out of the box, and it sounds great. And there's so many things that we could do if we just step outside of the routine.
Or if you partner, because interestingly, I've had my students do videos, and I have bunches of them that I can share, but I make them make videos because they said to me one day, I said, what if we get on the radio and talk about this? And they said, Professor Bell, nobody listens to the radio anymore. And I said, really? I didn't know. Well, what do y'all do? So they all told me they use Instagram and Snapchat. So they make these little videos and they send them on Instagram, and it's just them telling their stories about why they want to be a part of jury service now that they understand the science. But I would have never known to do that had I not partnered with them, right? And Will, he does a lot of work in barbershops, right? Because on a barbershop, if you're black people are always into hair, right? So you're going to find a bunch of black folks getting their hair done on the weekend. So he does a lot of work in the barbershop. So that's another thing. I talk to a lot of school kids, and they talk to their parents. Now, here's something funny. When we went into Angola to speak, and we said to those inmates, hey, listen, this law is not going to be retroactive, so you all are not going to benefit from this. But they said, we still want to help because it's going to spare our children and our nephews and our cousins. So guess who was calling home to make mama and aunts and uncles go vote? It was those folks. They actually started a voting campaign behind bars, and they had cheerleaders because they were so afraid of their children being convicted by these juries. Now, you would have never thought, right? But that's outreach. So you have to partner with people, and that's why I was talking about that empathy slide and that slide about equity and equality, because that's what it takes. It takes that type of interest in equality and equity to be able to achieve those partnerships. Yes, sir.
I was intrigued by that kind of notion about digital summonses.
Yes.
So, the part that hit on Baton Rouge, well, in our jury management office, we have boxes and boxes of return jury notices because, as you put it, some of the people move and they go everywhere, so they just get returned, and we've got so many of them that, and then you got to scratch your names off the rolls and then find out who's left, and so that's part of the problem we face, at least in East Baton Rouge, is just the sheer volume of summonses that we send out that get returned because we can't find the voters or the members or the citizens to come to court.
When I saw that, I thought, wow, that was a brilliant solution, to send them out electronically. I love that.
A lot of hurdles to make that
I
happen.
agree.
We just started doing, like emails for services for lawyers and all that. Maybe the Law Institute can look into that and put that somewhere down the line. But that looked like
It could be a solution.
Good result.
Yes. Any other questions or comments? None? Well, you all have my contact information in your materials, so feel free if I can help further. I'm definitely willing. All right.